Welcome to the roundup of Wild West adventure. Thank you for listening to Kicking Dust. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button now, so you don't miss a single action-packed Western. Chapter 1. Rip Campbell left the Pecos Basin with 50 head of cattle and a dream. For weeks he drove high into Arizona Badlands, northwest to the border, seeking the Valley of Grass. Back in the Pecos Basin, they said Rip was touched in the head with grass to feed all Texas beef. They didn't get Rip's dream. Texas was fine if you didn't mind being bounded by ranches after saving a lifetime for your own spread. To a 28-year-old, a lifetime's a long wait. Rip figured pushing beyond settlements, claiming government land, he'd be his own master. He saved cowhand salary from Boss Morton's Lazy L, bought 50 of Lazy L's best cattle stock, and pulled out. A saddle tramp told Rip of the 60-mile Valley of Grass, hidden in Arizona hills, no ranch within 500 miles. This dream drove him northwest through difficulties. Just pioneer difficulties, grazing and water search, blind trails, nothing to make a story. Rip's story began when he met the Griffith brothers. He was worried. His herd leaned from travel and poor grazing. High in northern Arizona hills, broken rocky ridges and parched canyons, he wondered if the wanderer lied about the Valley of Grass. It was supposed to be further north, but the country worsened, hard to imagine lush valleys hidden among bare peaks. Then a deep canyon barred his way, a river flowing along its floor. To go north, he had to cross. He chose west, praying he'd chosen right to find a trail to lower to the river. In one way, he had. An hour's drive, with the sweet smell of water exciting the herd to livelier movement, brought him to a narrow trail which dropped steadily to the canyon floor. Unfortunately, it also led him to the Griffith brothers. It was a shock to find the sparkling river water unreachable from this side. The near bank was a rock ledge, the river 12 feet below. Cattle bellowed in baffled rage, stamping up and down the bank, water so close yet beyond reach. Then Rip, loping west along the river, came to a stout wooden bridge, away to the sloping dirt riverbank on the far side. At the far side, two men appeared. They strolled across, nodding at Rip. "Howdy, stranger," the taller man called. He was thin, with small black eyes and an off-center nose, giving him a sly, cunning look. He said, "I'm Cal Griffith. This is my brother, Martin. Good to see a new face. Come far?" "Heading out from Texas," Rip said, nodding north. "Looking for grazing country, but need water now. Good to find this river. Reckon I'll drive my stock across the bridge and let them drink." "Sure." Cal Griffith grinned. "That's what the bridge is for, stranger. Only cost you $1 a head." "Ain't no trouble about that," Rip said, tossing a silver dollar to the tall man. "Just hold on a minute, stranger," Cal Griffith said while his brother grinned. "I said, it'll cost you $1 a head." "I heard you," Rip said. "I gave you the dollar. I've got no riders, no wife, nobody else at all. There's only me." "You and some cows," Griffith said. $1 a head. How many head are you running?" Rip had been about to ride back along the river bank, but he reined up, staring at the brothers in astonishment. Then he laughed. "You're joking. The government would never ask $1 a head for cattle to cross a bridge." "This ain't got nothing to do with the government," Griffith said. "This here bridge was built by Lou Hogan, who runs a store up at the mining town of White Ridge. Lou needed the bridge for bringing in supplies, but it cost money to build, see? And if folks want to use it, they've got to pay." "All right," Rip said, his lean face tight beneath its stubble. "I'll pay a fair toll, sure. But $1 a head is plumb ridiculous. I've got 50 head of stock. I sure ain't paying you $50. $50, the shorter brother said, speaking at last. He was younger than Cal, smooth-faced and lazy-voiced. "It ain't our idea, mister. We just work for Lou Hogan." Rip mopped his sweating face with a neckerchief angry and baffled. He had to get his stock watered, and soon. If these robbing polecats insisted on $50, he'd have to give in. He couldn't see his herd die. At last he said, "All right, dang blast you. $50. Make out a promise to pay, and I'll sign it." "No good," Cal said, grinning. "Lou always deals in cash." "I haven't got $50, Rip said, a cold note of menace in his voice. "I'm Rip Campbell, and back in the Pecos Basin they'd take my word for $50. I don't like having my word doubted. You write a bill, I'll sign it. Then when I get to White Ridge I'll sell a couple of steers for beef and pay Hogan his blood money." "Like hell you will," Cal said. "Once across the bridge, you'd forget the whole thing." "Damn you," Rip cried, anger driving his right hand to the .45 holstered at his right thigh. But before his fist closed on the grip, Martin Griffith's Colt aimed at his head. Rip's hand froze. It had been lightning fast, one of the quickest draws Rip had ever seen. Slowly, his hand came away, and the smiling Martin spun his Colt and sheathed it. "Wise hombre," he drawled. "Now get going, Campbell, because if you ain't got $50, we don't want to know you." Rip jogged his mount away, seething with baffled rage. All along that impossible rock bank, the stock were strung out, frantic for water. There it was, 12 feet away, but might as well have been 12 miles. The riverbank was a sheer wall, and he rode eastward until sundown without finding any change. Slowly, he headed back toward the bridge, riding in the sun's afterglow. He was stifling his rage. Anger would get him nowhere, and this problem required clear thinking. Chapter 2. By darkness, he'd done a lot of thinking and formed a plan. It was a dangerous plan, but he was determined. The reward was worth the danger, he felt. Water for his precious 50 head. To keep his dream alive, he would face any danger. Now it was dark, maybe half a mile from the bridge, out of sight of the Griffiths due to a canyon bend. He unpacked and made camp, while his cattle waited along the riverbank, bellowing restlessly. As he smoked, the campfire died. At his third cigarette's end, it was embers. Rip slid from his bunk, rolled a blanket to look like a sleeping form for safety, in case a Griffith came snooping. Quietly, he left camp and went to the river. Above, stars shone brightly from a velvet sky, their glow lighting the country with clear blue light best found in lonely places. The river gurgled silver below the rocky bank. It was maybe 60 feet wide. Rip wore his gun belt, the .45 holstered but cartridges removed from the cylinder and spare slugs left in his bunk. Wet bullets wouldn't fire, and Rip's desperate plan included a wetting. Leaving his sweat-stained hat on the bank, Rip lowered himself over the side and splashed into the water. He hadn't risked a dive into this unknown stream in the dark, but now found he could have. It was deep, flowing cleanly. He swam for the opposite bank. He was a good swimmer, and it wasn't far, but waterlogged clothing and the .45's weight made him glad to feel the sandy slope of the north bank underfoot. He was out of the water, resting. The north bank sloped easily, and here his cattle could stand 4 feet in water and drink. Or they could when he got them across. That was the problem, one solution. The stock could only cross by the bridge. That meant the Griffiths must be put out of action. Now Rip Campbell was making his way to the bridge to attack from the rear. It was a cinch. Whoever guarded the bridge would face south, alert for movement. The last thing they'd think of was attack from their side of the river. On that hope, Rip was acting. In the glowing starlight, he walked leisurely toward the bridge, water streaming from his clothes, and minutes later saw the gray timber of the bridge shape itself in the night. Then he saw the tiny hut, or cabin, that stood a little further west beyond the bridge. All was quiet, save the occasional steer bellow on the other riverbank. For the bellows, Rip was grateful. They would keep the guards' attention trained southward, Rip thought. He moved silently closer, and saw the glow of a lone cigarette at the southern bridge end. For long minutes Rip waited, listening. He knew two men guarding the bridge wouldn't remain silent long. But there were no voices. He guessed, as he'd figured earlier, they were doing watch for watch, the other asleep in the hut. Now he moved onto the bridge and began to cross, hoping against creaking timber. Luck was with him, or maybe the heavy half-logs underfoot were too solid to creak. Soon, he was close enough to see the shape of the man holding the glowing cigarette. He sat on a box at the bridge entrance, a heavy rail blocking the way. He seemed a small hombre, and Rip guessed it was Martin, in his estimation the most dangerous of the two. Rip drew the empty .45 from his wet holster, and at that moment the guard seemed to sense danger behind. He swung round, rising from his box. "My gun's out," Rip hissed. "You're fast but not that fast. Soon as you touch your Colt, I'll plug you." "What the hell?" Griffith was backed against the blocking rail, peering at Rip, seeing the starlight glint on the .45. He said, "How'd you get behind me, blast you?" "Never mind," Rip said. "Just what I'm going to do next is all you need know. Don't make a noise. Be nice and sociable, and we'll get along fine. Up with your hands and turn round." The short man obeyed, slowly. Rip stepped nearer to reach for his gun. Then Martin Griffith's hand suddenly closed over Rip. He spoke quickly, excitedly. "No, you don't. I'm wise to you now. You swam the river. You bluffed me with a wet gun." He twisted savagely, his fist gripping Rip's as Rip tried to jerk the Colt from his holster. In a split second, Rip realized his life hung in the balance, no time for niceties. Swiftly, he raised his empty gun, and as Martin clawed his other hand off the Colt, he brought his cold .45 down on Martin's scalp. It was a cruel blow, but it ended argument. Now Martin lay silent on the bridge. Rip acted quickly. He saw the blocking rail, found it bound with ropes. He took a jackknife, slashed the ropes. He used them to securely tie the moaning man, then threw the blocking rail aside, clearing the bridge. He dragged the roped-up body toward the cabin. 10 yards from it, he left his burden and continued alone. Ear against the wall, he heard snoring inside. He tried the door, found it unlocked, and glided into the darkness. The snores guided him to a bunk, and from the slight star glow, he made out Cal Griffith's lean face. It was a nasty awakening for the tall man, as Rip rammed his brother's Colt at his ribs and said, "All right, big brother, act agreeable or you'll finish cold like Martin." "What the?" But the startled question died as Cal realized the position, and his next action was a shocker, catching Rip off balance. Casually, the hombre brought a hand from under a blanket, and there was fire and thunder in the cabin, a hot bullet fanning Rip's face. A second shot followed, almost a continuation of the first. That one slapped flesh from Rip's right arm, and he dropped the stolen Colt. Cal kept blasting, his bullets probing the darkness as Rip dropped and rolled. Then the firing stopped. There was silence. There in the darkness, Rip tried to think, his mind going back over the shock-filled seconds to count the echoes. 5 shots, he thought, though he couldn't be sure. Moments later, he knew he was right. He heard Cal's bunk creak and saw vague movement. Cal was sitting up, anxiously peering at the dark floor and hut corners. Rip could see the shine of his gun as he swayed it about. The tall man had fired 5 shots, wasn't sure if he'd scored, and was keeping the 6th for a finish if needed. Rip barely dared to breathe. He saw the gun shine pointing toward him, and sweated, wondering if Griffith could see him. Then, in the window's starlight, he saw Griffith leave his bunk, walking slowly about the room, one bare foot probing dark places. That suited Rip fine. He waited, and when the searching foot came within reach, he yanked it savagely. The 6th bullet smashed wood from the floor as Cal crashed, and Cal was under Rip's writhing weight, taking a beating. The thin man struggled to roll free, but his strength couldn't match Campbell's. With well-placed jaw punches, Rip silenced him. Then he quickly bound him with blanket strips, and ignoring his bullet-creased arm's pain, went out and dragged Martin into the hut to join his brother. Martin was conscious, heaving uselessly in his bonds, turning the air blue with language. Rip went back to the bridge, crossed, walked the half-mile back to camp, and saddled up. It took time to get the stock moving in the dark, and it was maybe 2 hours before they were lining the river's north bank to drink. Rip let his horse drink too, while he rolled a smoke and thought hard. There was something weird about this setup, he thought. Something deep, with issues far more important than toll payment. Chapter 3. The next day, driving his tiny herd deeper into northern hills, Rip Campbell wondered about Lou Hogan and the Griffith brothers. The more he thought, the more certain he was they planned to block him. The dollar a head cold cash was a blind. No sane man would expect such a fee. He'd never heard of Lou Hogan, had no enemies here or elsewhere as far as he knew. He'd heard of White Ridge, sure. Gold had been found there, in North Arizona hills. There'd been a rush, but the first finds hadn't fulfilled promise and excitement died. But he knew White Ridge, the town, lived. Men washing for color along the creek were making a living, and there was always the chance more nugget gold would be found. Many who'd spent savings and crossed the West were content to stay until something better turned up. That was White Ridge's story as Rip knew it, from saloon gossip and travelers' talk back in Texas. He didn't know White Ridge's exact location, but from the Griffiths' remarks he guessed it wasn't far. And Hogan, whose bridge he'd crossed, ran a store there. Rip was anxious to meet him. Meanwhile, the man had other worries. Grass and alfalfa along these ridges were scarce, his herd stripping it clean as they passed. As yet, there was no sign of the promised valley of grass, and he figured there should have been by now. One thing was certain. If he didn't find good grazing soon, his venture would fail. The stock were lean and weary, soon to die off. And added to this was the worry that, when they got loose, the Griffith brothers would likely trail him. That younger one, Martin, was dangerous, not the kind to take a beating without evening it up. That night he camped dry, in a valley between ridges, the sun's glow like molten fire in the west, turning the world to gold. In such light, Rip scanned the distance, despair in his heart. There was no sign of the pursuing Griffiths, certainly, but a lush grass valley in such rocky dryness seemed impossible. Rip slept fitfully, his mind restless with worry. In dawn twilight he was up, scanning southward again, but still saw no sign of the Griffiths. Playing safe, he skipped a fire and breakfasted cold, figuring if they were searching, he wasn't keen to guide them with campfire smoke. Before sunup, he was pushing north again, his gaze hungrily searching for grass as each new ridge was topped. He discovered nothing of interest until midday, and then it wasn't grass. It was a town, a huddle of shabby wooden buildings along a creek to the west. Rip swung toward it. White Ridge, he thought. And he felt bound to see Lou Hogan, not happy about the action he'd been forced to take, and anxious to show he'd been in the right. Then there was the creek. At last, his stock would drink. And that led to another thought. Maybe there would be feed, too. His stock sure needed feed. Likely there were horses in White Ridge, and a feed merchant with hay to sell. Rip was willing to sell a few head for fresh meat, in exchange for hay to feed the remainder. The town was bigger than it seemed, and shabbier. The wooden buildings were sun-blistered and leaning, the streets dusty, the boardwalks broken. Yet there were plenty of people about, staring curiously at Rip as he jogged his ragged buckskin, searching for Hogan's store. In the street's middle, he reined back and called to a man who loafed against a saloon veranda post. "Howdy," Rip said. "I'm looking for Lou Hogan's place. Can you put me on the trail?" "Stranger, huh?" the man drawled with a tight grin. "Looking for Hogan's place? Which place?" "I was told he runs a store in this town," Rip said patiently. "Sure does," the man drawled. "Also the bank, the town corral, 3 saloons and a beanery." Which place was you wanting, stranger? Rip laughed and said, Guess it's Hogan himself I want to see. Where would I likely find him? Where the money is. Lou ain't never far from a pile of money, mister. The bank's at the street's end, that way. He pointed. Rip hitched his horse to a rail outside the bank. It was called Hogan's Trading Bank and Loan Company, a building more solid than its fellows, made of heavy split logs and sporting a couple of pine-framed windows. Rip walked in. A bald-headed clerk behind an iron grill nodded and said, Howdy, stranger. What can I do for you? Rip asked for Lou Hogan, and met the man's dubious gaze with, It's kind of important, something about the Griffith brothers and that bridge they're guarding. The clerk shrugged and went to a back room. There was a soft buzz of voices, then Lou Hogan came out. Rip knew he was Hogan because he looked like a man who would never be far from a pile of money. A lean hombre with shrewd gray eyes and tight lips, a smooth smile masking his hunger, and wearing expensive clothes that couldn't quite disguise something cheap. Howdy, he said, his voice soft and deep. What's all this about my bridge, huh? Anything wrong, down in Long Knife Canyon? Nothing, Rip drawled, except that your men tried to collect $50 toll from me, so I had to kind of force my way across the bridge. And seeing that I'm not a fella to run away from what I've done, I kind of looked you up. $50, Hogan said, his eyebrows raised. Say, there's some mistake, I reckon. $1's all the toll I ask. Sure, Rip grinned. $1 a head, huh? And seeing that I was trailing 50 head of cattle, the Griffith boys figured I was up for $50. Cattle, huh? For a moment, the smile vanished from Hogan's face, but soon it was back. Looking curiously at Rip, he said, Well, I guess the boys maybe kept too close to the letter of the law, so to speak. Of course, I wouldn't demand $1 a head for cattle. But Cal Griffith wouldn't know what to do, I reckon. We've never had cattle up on the ridges before. Rip smiled slowly. He said, that wasn't the way of it at all. The Griffiths didn't act like they didn't know what to do. They was dang certain about the $50. And as I didn't have the money, I had to get kind of tough. Likely they'll be gunning for me now. But I wanted you to know how it was. I'll speak to the Griffiths, Hogan said sharply. They won't be gunning for you if I've got any say on the ridges. But about your cattle, where are they now? Drinking from the stream east of town, Rip said, jerking his head. I was wondering whether maybe I could sell a few steers for hay. Sure, Hogan said, beaming now, like a man suddenly relieved of a private fear. No trouble about that, Mr. Campbell, Rip said. Rip Campbell. Well, you'll have no trouble selling your steers, Mr. Campbell. Long time since folks up here have tasted good Texas beef. Mostly we eat salted meat, brought down from Utah by Mormon traders. I'll take your herd off your hands right now, and pay you in hard cash. Let's see now, the market price is around $12 a carcass, so. Hold it, Rip broke in. I'm not fixing to sell the herd. All I want to do is sell maybe a couple, so as I can buy feed for the rest. Now the beaming smile was gone, and Hogan shrugged. He said slowly, Then what? Then I'll be on my way, Rip drawled. Where? I don't savvy you at all, Hogan frowned. What have you brought cattle to the ridges for, if you don't want to sell? I aim to settle and start me a ranch, Rip said, if it's any of your dang business. A ranch? In these rocky hills? Hogan laughed loudly, but to Rip the laugh didn't ring true. Man, are you loco? Maybe. What say you let me worry about that, huh? I'm here to pay whatever you say I owe for crossing your bridge. How much? The hell with it, Hogan said. I'm not worried about an odd dollar. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm kind of busy. What about beef? Rip said, as Hogan turned to go back to his room. I mean, you run the town store. Likely if I want to sell a couple of steers, I'll have to sell them to you. Not interested, Hogan said. The whole 50 head, sure. But the profit on a couple of carcasses isn't worth bothering about. You run along and start your ranch." With laughter deep in his throat, the banker vanished into his office. Rip didn't begin to understand it. All he knew was that through no fault of his own, he had made 3 enemies in this hill country. But the most pressing worry was keeping his stock alive. Chapter 4. He walked around town, leading his tired horse, looking for buyers. There didn't seem to be any. Hogan's store was the only one, a big building with assistants behind well-stocked counters. At last, he gave up. He left his buckskin at Hogan's corral, parted with $3 to have it washed and fed. Then he strolled into Hogan's Ace Saloon and called for a drink to wash the trail dust from his throat. Rip wasn't a hard-drinking man, but now he was at his tether's end, low in spirit, and the burning whiskey gave him a lift. He had a second and a third, not caring about his dwindling coins. By the time he'd sunk the 4th, he'd developed a glowing resentment against Lou Hogan, who refused to buy steers because the profit wasn't worth bothering about. "This is lousy whiskey," he drawled to the barkeep. "There's water in it, I reckon." The barkeep was a melancholy man with a face like a full moon. He said, "No water, stranger. It's just cheap liquor, that's all." "So what? Go to another saloon, and you'll get the same. Hogan owns them all, and buys the cheapest whiskey offering, huh?" Rip grinned. "Yeah, that's Hogan, I reckon. You want to know something, mister?" "I know it already," the barkeep said gloomily. "You don't like Hogan." "Neither do I. He works me hard and pays me short." "What has he done to you?" "Killed a dream." Rip hurled his empty glass against a wall, swearing savagely. Then he told the barkeep about his herd and the urgent need to feed them. He said, "Down the street a ways I saw a feed merchant's store, and it doesn't belong to Hogan. I could buy hay there if I had the money. But Hogan won't buy any beef, so I can't raise the money." "Beef?" The barkeep's expression was gloomier than ever. He said, "Fella, we haven't tasted fresh beef in this doggone town for months. If I was you, I'd mosey along the creek up there, west of town, and kind of have a little chat to the miners. Those boys are ready to sell their washpans for fresh meat." It was an idea, and hope came to life once more in Rip's heart. He paid for the glass he'd smashed, left the saloon, and walked west along the creek. Soon he was among the tents and makeshift huts which served the miners for home. The dwellings housed whole families, women cooking at outside fireplaces and mending clothes, while the children whose fathers scratched and washed for gold played along the stream bank. Rip Campbell walked on, and at last came to a group of men sifting color in midstream. A freckled man with ginger hair looked up as he approached, and Rip nodded. "Howdy, mister. Got some beef to sell, if you're interested." The man shrugged, still gently cradling his pan of mud and sand. He said, "Got all the beef we need, stranger. Hogan's store supplies this town, at 10 cents a can." There was something about the way he said it, like a man smarting under an injustice that couldn't be rectified. Rip Campbell laughed. "Mister, you've got me wrong. My beef ain't in cans, it's alive and walking." The red-headed man lost interest in his pan, and several men nearby jerked eager glances at Rip. 6 or 7 men sloshed out of the stream toward Rip, eagerness lighting their eyes. Rip said, "It's no joke, fellas. I've got a herd, and aim to take them further north, but I'm forced to sell a couple of cows to get money for feed." "A couple?" Now they were grouped about Rip, protesting in chorus. "Stranger, there's maybe 60 families along this creek. How far are 2 steers going to go?" "All right." Rip wasn't a man to try to drive a one-sided bargain, and now he made a quick decision. He said, "I'll let 10 cows go, at the market price. $12 a head." "It's a deal," the redhead said. Then, as the others hurried in all directions to spread the good news, he shook Rip's hand. "You're a white man, stranger. Up here along the ridges, beef is worth more than market price. You could have asked $20, and we'd have paid." "I wouldn't try to cash in on folks' hunger," Rip shrugged. "That's what I figured. My name's Willis, Seth, they call me." Rip liked the freckled man, and figured here was a chance to make a friend. If he was going to stay in the ridges, he was sure going to need friends, he thought. He said, "Pleased to meet you, Seth. I'm Rip Campbell. Let's go and cut out 10 steers from my herd." Together they walked back through the town and east of it, where the cattle rested along the creek bank. As they walked, Rip told of his trouble at the Long Knife Bridge, and of how Hogan had refused to buy a couple of steers. "He's the son of a French Canadian and a Comanche squaw," Seth said. "Seems to me he's kind of inherited more Comanche than French. A fella like that bears watching, he sure does." The two men selected 10 steers and drove them leisurely through the town to the miners' huts. There was a lot of excitement, women and children milling about happily at sight of the long-needed meat. The steers were left far along the creek bank, to the mercy of 2 miners who'd once been butchers. Back among the huts, the men held a money-juggling conference, and Seth Willis poured $120 into Rip's hands. "Now for that doggone hay," Rip grinned. "Man, this deal has saved me a heap of grief." "That's fine," Willis said. "Then, look, Rip, if you're fixing to stay in town overnight while the herd's feeding, I can put you up. I got a good hut and no family." "Thanks, fella, but—" Rip frowned. "Reckon I'll camp with the herd. I'm kind of remembering that warning you gave me." "Maybe you're wise," Seth said. "Anyways, you've got to eat with me tonight. That I insist on." So Rip was the guest of his new friend, and after the evening meal they smoked and yarned. To the Texan, who'd come so far with only the cattle for company, it was an enjoyable night. But soon he tore himself away, anxious about his herd. The feed merchant had carried bales of hay by wagon and left them opened along the eastern creek bank. Now, under the stars, the cows still munched contentedly. Chapter 5. Rip found a place to camp, bunked down, and rested. From here, if anyone interfered with his herd, he would be alerted quickly and snap into action. He lit a cigarette and lay listening to the silence until it was broken by the soft fall of approaching feet. Rip tensed and got to his feet, one hand on the gun at his thigh. Then a figure shaped white in the gloom, close to him. It was a woman. Rip's hat came off in polite greeting. Under the stars, the young woman's bare head seemed white, and he guessed her hair was yellow or golden. She wore a light-colored dress, flaring prettily from a trim waist, so he knew she was young, little more than a girl. All this he saw as he greeted her with, "Good night, ma'am. Did you want to see me?" She had come boldly to him in the dark, and then seemed a little embarrassed and tongue-tied, but under his easy politeness she found her voice. "I heard some talk," she said softly. "Bad talk, I wasn't supposed to hear it at all. But I must warn you. They mean you great harm." She hesitated. "Kinda nice of you to warn me, ma'am," Rip said. "Who's out to hurt me? Maybe if you told me just what happened." "Yes. I'll tell you, Mr. Campbell. I know your name. The whole town's talking about you and the fresh beef you brought in. I'm Daisy Sanderson, and I work at the Aero Cafe. I'm a waitress there. And tonight I overheard these 2 men talking about you. They're going to follow you out of town and kill you." "Which 2 men?" Rip prompted. "And why do they aim to kill me?" "I don't know why," the girl said urgently. "All I know is that they're planning to follow you when you leave. They're Kit Ferris and Virgil Morgan. They're bad men, Mr. Campbell, especially Morgan." Her voice was low and tense, and she kept looking back toward the town lights like she was afraid of something. There was a silence, and she seemed to sense his curiosity about her backward glances. She said, Virgil Morgan was sort of telling the plan to Ferris, as if he'd got the instructions from somebody else. I heard him say your name, and the words, trail him out of town and kill. I was at the table putting their meals down, and Morgan hadn't realized I was at his elbow. He kept looking at me after that, like he was trying to fathom whether I'd heard what had been said. I tried to act natural, like I hadn't heard a thing. Then at 10 o'clock, after the cafe closed, I sneaked out the back way in case he was watching the place. There was a clear frankness about her voice, so Rip didn't doubt her for a moment. He was touched and full of admiration for her courage. He found himself wishing he could see her face properly. All he could see in the starlight was the white face and wealth of hair and the shine of wide eyes. Seems to me you took a big chance, and just to warn a stranger, he said. Well, there's more to it than that, Daisy Sanderson said hesitantly. I'll be honest, Mr. Campbell. The thought of anybody being murdered horrifies me, of course, but I'm also out to cross that Virgil Morgan whenever the chance offers. He's a beast, and I hate him. It's a long story, Mr. Campbell, but Morgan murdered my uncle Jed Sanderson back in New Mexico. I see, Rip said. He peered at her in the dark, then spread a blanket from his bunk. He said, if you'd care to sit down and tell me about it, Miss Sanderson. She took a while to make up her mind, glancing back at the town and looking doubtfully at Rip. The Texan stepped away from the spread blanket and sat on his bunk. Then the girl lowered to the blanket and sighed. It's a nasty story, Mr. Campbell. My Uncle Jed was a battler, trying to make his Long Y ranch pay, though it was on the dry side of San Jose Valley, and a pretty hopeless proposition. But he was a happy old man who wouldn't have hurt anyone. Everybody liked him. I know, because I lived on the Long Y since my parents were killed in a train smash when I was 10. Then a government development scheme reached New Mexico, and it became known that they were planning a dam for the San Jose River. It seemed like it would be the end of Uncle's worries, even though 2 or 3 years would pass before the dam was finished. Uncle was deeply in debt, you see, but because it was recognized that the dam would turn his ranch into a paying concern, watering his land and changing the whole face of his range, the creditors were willing to wait. Then a man named Virgil Morgan came to San Jose Valley and wanted to buy the Long Y. Uncle laughed. He said that if he'd got an offer for it a year earlier, he'd have been glad to sell, but with the promised dam in the picture, he wouldn't sell for the world. Water was the one thing he needed to make the Y a success. Uncle was especially amused because of the ridiculously low price Morgan offered. Morgan said he represented a syndicate of businessmen who'd had the Long Y valued by a valuator. Did he offer any proof? Rip asked. That he represented a syndicate, I mean. Yes. He showed Uncle Jed papers from? She hesitated, thinking back. Then, yes, I remember now. The syndicate was called Rangeland Investments. Of course, they were out to get the Long Y for a song, and sell it at a huge profit when the dam was completed. Uncle treated it as an attempt at a piece of shrewd business and forgot about it. He didn't realize that the syndicate had no intention of forgetting about it. That Virgil Morgan kept calling and pestering Uncle Jed, but the offered price was never raised. Uncle Jed at last got angry and ordered Morgan to stay off his property. Then one day I was out riding a little Pinto I used to own, and I heard a shot in the hills. Just one shot. I topped a rise and saw a man ride away from behind a rocky outcrop. He was Virgil Morgan. I recognized the wide yellow hat he wore and the big black horse he always rode. I headed for the outcrop and found Uncle Jed dead. He'd been shot through the head. That was just 3 years ago when I was 19, and I still see poor Uncle at times lying there dead. Rip was silent a while, respecting the girl's feelings. Then he said, I don't understand, Miss Sanderson. Why did Morgan kill your uncle? "Don't you see?" the girl said. "Uncle was up to his ears in debt. When he died, the creditors clamored for their money, and the syndicate cleared the debts and took possession of the ranch. It was all planned legally by a bunch of smart lawyers and went through without a hitch. Evidently they'd employed Virgil Morgan to try to buy the ranch for a song if possible, and when that failed, they planned to get it the other way." "And what about this Morgan hombre?" Rip asked. "Wasn't he ever caught?" "Caught?" Daisy's voice was bitter. "He didn't even bother to run. I told my story to the marshal, and Morgan was arrested and tried. The trial was a farce. Morgan produced a bunch of friends to prove that he'd been playing poker in a San Jose saloon at the time of the killing. Oh, it was all planned, I tell you, right to the last detail." "Sure was a nasty setup," Rip said softly. "And you say that the same Virgil Morgan is right here in White Ridge, huh? Doesn't he recognize you?" "I don't think so. It's hard to say. He looks at me a lot, but his type always stare at girls. He might not know who I am. I didn't meet him at the Long Y, just saw him talking to Uncle Jed at different times. And by the time I gave my story in court, I was very sick with shock and grief. Now I'm myself again, so he maybe doesn't connect me with the girl at the San Jose trial." Rip was very interested and curious. He said, "Those danged unscrupulous friends of Morgan, the ones who alibied him, do you remember their names?" "Kit Ferris was one," the girl said at once. "Then there were two brothers named Griffith, and some others I've forgotten." Mention of the Griffiths was a surprise, and started Rip's thoughts moving in an unexpected direction. But before they'd moved far, there was a faint scuffling sound in sagebrush nearby, and he heard the girl gasp. "What was that?" she whispered loudly, scrambling to her feet. Rip got up too, and stepped close to her. "Just a jackrabbit, maybe. I don't see anybody." He was peering in the starlight, certain that if anyone was moving about, he would see them. Then he said, "You're scared, Miss Sanderson. I'll walk back to town with you, huh? Where do you live?" "In a room above the Arrow Cafe," she said. "It's run by an old friend of poor Uncle Jed, Mrs. Johnson. I went to her when Uncle died, and those wolves took over the Long Y. I sure would appreciate your company, Mr. Campbell." They walked slowly townward, Rip said. "I'd like to kind of thank you for warning me about that Virgil Morgan." "You already have," she reminded him. "Yes, I know. But I'd like to again. Seems like, if Morgan does suspect that you overheard his talk with Ferris, you took a long chance coming to see me. I sure won't forget it, Miss Sanderson. And if there's ever anything I can do for you—" "It's all right," she broke in softly. "I guess I only imagine that Morgan was suspicious." Then curiously, "Why would he want to kill you, Mr. Campbell?" Rip shrugged. Now they were walking the broken boardwalks, and when they came to a darkened storefront that sported the sign Arrow Cafe, the girl said, "I'll slip in the back way, down the alley at the side." He went down the alley with her. A light showed in a back room, and Daisy Sanderson paused at the door. "Now I'll be safe enough," she said softly. "Good night, Mr. Campbell." She pushed the door open, and in the brief instant before she passed inside, the light was on her face. That flashing glimpse of loveliness stayed with Rip Campbell as he strolled back to his herd. He reached his bunk and lay down, looking at the stars and reverting his thoughts to the worries of the moment. He didn't sleep much that night. Chapter 6. The morning dawned fine but cloudy. The northern sky spread with darkness, and he thought that heavy rain in that direction might be all to the good when he got moving again. At least it would assure a supply of water. Rip was figuring to rest and feed the herd for another full day, and pull out the next morning. He spent the morning at Hogan's store, buying provisions to replenish his packs, then checked on the treatment of his horse at the town corral. He lunched at the Arrow Cafe. Daisy seemed shy, like a girl slightly embarrassed at her action of the previous night. But she was beautiful, like Rip remembered, and though they didn't talk much, he was pleased just to look at her soft loveliness each time she came to his table. But he lingered a while when the meal was finished, and the girl seemed to conquer her shyness to smile at him. He said, "That sure was a tasty meal, and you can tell Mrs. Jackson I said so." "Mrs. Johnson," she corrected. "And you can tell her I'll be back for another tonight," Rip grinned. "After so long on the trail, I sure do appreciate good cookin'. You're not pulling out today, Mr. Campbell?" "Tomorrow, I guess," he answered, and saw the shadow of anxiety cross her face. He said, "I'll be real careful." She was clearing the things from his table and taking longer than was necessary. She said awkwardly, "How far? Where are you taking your herd, Mr. Campbell?" "Oh, I know it's no business of mine, but, well, folks say you're a nice man but maybe a little crazy. Do you really expect to find grazing range among these terrible rocks and ridges?" "Sure do," Rip said. "But I don't blame folks for being kind of doubtful. Before I hit White Ridge, I was beginning to be doubtful myself." "And you're not doubtful more?" "Not since a lot of folks I'd never met began to act like they didn't want me around," Rip said slowly. "I've kind of got a theory about it." He left the cafe and walked along the creek to the mining huts where men ate in the midday shade. The sun was out now, though dark clouds still lingered in the north. From the shade of a hut wall a voice hailed, and Rip quickened his step to join the grinning Seth Willis. They yarned for a while, shared cigarettes from Rip's sack of Durham, and lazed against the hut. It was good to be with Willis. Rip Campbell had an instinct about men, and knew that in the nearby muddy outfit of the Gold Scratcher there stood a man worth knowing. After a lot of easy small talk, he switched the conversation to something which had come to mind quite suddenly, the germ of an idea that might make the difference between success and failure. "You told me you had no family yesterday, Seth," he said slowly. "I take it you've just never settled down, huh?" "You take it right," Willis grinned. "Family's all right, I guess, if you're the kind of guy that doesn't mind being hogtied. Me, I like my freedom. I like to go where I like, and stay as long as I want. Plumb selfish, I guess." Rip laughed and said, "Do you get much color from the creek?" "Regular supply of dust," Willis shrugged. "Regular but light. Man could earn as much riding herd in the cattle country, I guess." "Then you ain't keen on staying here?" Rip asked. "Nope. Been here a year now, and that's longer than I usually stay anywhere. It's the uncertainty, I reckon. Man might pick up a fortune, kind of sudden, any time, so he keeps scratching and hoping." "With me it's different," Rip said. "I'm a cattleman born and bred, and I don't want to dig for my fortune. I want to see it growing all around me. Beef on the hoof." "I can understand that," Willis said. "But I'm danged if I can figure why you've come to the ridges." "Then I'll tell you," Rip said. He pointed to the dark north. "Up there somewhere there's good rangeland. A valley of grass and alfalfa, 60 miles wide and God knows how long. It's in unsettled territory, and the government laws say that if I bunk down with a herd of cows on unsettled territory, the land is mine. I aim to find that valley, Seth. There'll be room for a cattleman to live and grow there. It's what I've always wanted. Trouble is, I find I can't do it alone. I figured I could, but I was plumb wrong." "That's so?" Willis asked, and there was an eagerness in his smile. "Keep talking, Rip Campbell. I'm listening." "I need a partner," Rip said, and his gaze held Willis's, and saw the answer shining plainly. Rip said, "I'm kind of worried about you, Miss Sanderson." It was after sundown, and he had eaten another of Mrs. Johnson's good meals but was reluctant to leave her waitress. Daisy smiled at him, and he thought he saw a soft light of sudden understanding in her blue eyes. "Why should you worry about me?" she wanted to know. "Why shouldn't I?" You took a long chance coming to warn me about Virgil Morgan, and we can't be sure that he doesn't suspect you. Seems to me, if he thinks it over and decides that you did overhear his plan, he'll take no chances. You'll be in danger. Or, if he ever recognizes you as the gal who accused him of murder in San Jose. Then the Texan stopped, slapping a hand on the table as sudden realization came. Say, there's your name. Sanderson, the same name as your uncle. Morgan must remember that name. Don't worry about it, the girl said. I'm just a waitress. Most everybody in town, except you, calls me Daisy. Not many know my surname, and Morgan hasn't been in town long. You make it sound like you're as safe as the cattleman's bank, Rip frowned, but I'm still going to worry. I'll be hitting the trail north, with no way of knowing whether you're all right. And that'll worry you. It sure will. Impulsively, he put his brown hand over her white one on the table. He said, Tell you what, I'll find a friend of Seth Willis's and have him keep an eye on you. I don't know many people here, but if he's a friend of Seth's, he'll be all right. Really, Mr. Campbell, there's no need. Most everybody, except you, calls me Rip. Maybe we'd better fix that, huh? Could we meet later, after you've knocked off, and kind of talk about it? She eased her hand from under his and said, I don't think so. But if Morgan trails me out of town and kills me, you'll never see me again, Rip grinned. Then you'll be sorry. Please don't joke about it, she said. Then she smiled a little, but avoided his gaze. I'll be finished here at 10. He went to a saloon to kill time, watched a poker game, joining a crowd round a table where 4 men played for high stakes. As card talk passed between the players, they called each other by name, and Rip soon discovered that one of them was Kit Ferris. He was a bony man of middle age, with a balding head and a lean, hungry look. Rip wondered whether Virgil Morgan was about, and marveled that he'd forgotten to ask Daisy for a description of the man. Anyway, he had a good look at Ferris, and would know him anywhere after this. As he turned from the card game, he met a lazy-eyed gaze close to his face, and saw recognition light the eyes of Martin Griffith. The unexpected meeting was a shock, producing a natural reaction. Rip Campbell's .45 was half out of his holster before he realized that Griffith had made no move to draw. The short man smiled lazily, but with venom. Kinda nervous, huh, Campbell? I don't blame you. Any hombre who cracks Martin Griffith over the skull and leaves him roped sure has reason to be jumpy. But you can relax. I ain't gunning for you tonight. You'll keep. He had spoken softly, close to Rip, so that bystanders were unaware of any enmity between them. In the same tone, Rip said, Thanks. Reckon I'd just as soon have the showdown now and be done with it. Seeing that you ain't doing anything else at the moment. Trouble is, it ain't convenient at the moment, Griffith grinned. Then he lifted a wrist and let his shirt sleeve fall a little, showing a mass of heavy bandages. He said, You roped us good and tight, Cal and I. We couldn't beat the ropes. In the end, I had to smash the cabin window and saw my wrist ropes on the broken glass. Kinda awkward, see? Gashed my arm and lost a lot of blood. But I heal kinda fast, fella, and you'll keep. He swung away and left the saloon. Rip wondered whether Cal was in town. Then he saw the freckled face of Seth Willis and joined him. Seth was drinking at the bar and said, Seeing that I'm pulling north tomorrow and leaving the joys of town life behind, I'm stowing away some of Hogan's lousy whiskey. Join me. Later in the night, Rip said. I've got a reason. All right. Then Seth looked at him curiously. What were you jawing with Martin Griffith about? Something unpleasant, I'll bet. He's got a gashed gun arm, Rip said. He's sore at me. I was stinging him, trying to make him draw. You was. Seth gulped whiskey, his eyes popping. Man, are you loco? Martin is the fastest gunslinger this side of hell. Unless you're damn quick yourself, he'd kill you sure. I ain't quick, Rip grinned. Accurate enough once I've got my gun out, but no quicker than the average honest citizen. That's why I tried to make him draw, don't you see, while his arm's bad. Maybe I'd have matched him that way. But he didn't fall for it. If I have to fight him someday when his arm's all right, it'll be curtains for Rip Campbell. But that's only one of my worries. He went on to tell about Daisy Sanderson. He had already told of the San Jose murder, but now he related his worries for the girl's safety and his plan to have a man watch over her. Seth was all for it. He said, "If Virgil Morgan is going to trail us out of town like you say Daisy says, then she'll be safe once he's gone. But likely he'll give us a day or two start, seeing that he aims to do his killing well away from town. I'll fix for a fella to watch the gal until Morgan pulls out." Chapter 7. Later, Rip met Daisy and talked with her at the door behind the cafe. The talk covered a lot of ground. He told her of the arrangement to guard her from Morgan. She told him to be careful and wanted to know how she'd ever find out whether he'd found his rangeland. Rip said that was easy enough to answer. And after a lot of soft and eager talk, she knew that once established on a range of his own, he would be coming back to claim her. It was late by the time he got back to the saloon, but Willis was waiting for him. They drank to the success of their partnership, washed it down with a second, and parted. It was with very mixed feelings that Rip went back to his bunk on the creek bank. Apart from being baffled over the sinister plot against him, he was happy that tomorrow would see him pushing on toward his dream once more. Again, this happiness was sobered at the prospect of being away from Daisy. Right now, he couldn't come to any definite conclusion as to whether finally he was happy or not. His thoughts were broken by the crack of a twig somewhere behind. He could see no movement. Yet he felt that somebody was back there, in the shadows. Someone had followed him from town, he figured, and they were now frozen still watching him. Grimly, he eased the gun in his holster. He walked on, right to his bunk near the resting steers. He sat down, rolling a smoke but not lighting it. He wasn't figuring to make himself a target for a 6-gun. Then, after long moments, his nerves tingled as he heard a soft footfall. It was very close. Waiting motionless, his form dissolved into the shadows so close to the ground, Rip was able to see the dark movement of a form against the flickering town lights. The man was maybe 10 feet away, peering in the night, vainly trying to spot Rip. The Texan saw the vague whiteness of something in his hand. And then the man moved silently to the bunk, the white thing in his hand probing the shadow. Rip grabbed the outstretched wrist. There was a curious cry, like a startled, choking gasp, as Rip closed with a short and heavy form and struggled with it. Not that there was much of a struggle. Rip was surprised when the man went down easily, the white thing fluttering away in the dark. Quickly, Rip dropped, straddling the intruder and digging hard fingers at the fat throat. "Hold it, I'm not fighting, dang you," a mournful voice protested. The voice was vaguely familiar to Rip, and he stopped trying to choke it off. Instead, he groped for matches from his pocket, still straddling the heavy form. "Let's have a look at you," he said, and flared a match. In the pale light, he saw a fleshy face, with doleful eyes and the sad lines of a pessimist. It was a surprise, and Rip frowned. "I know you," he said. "You're the barkeep at one of Hogan's saloons. What are you doing, sneaking around my camp? I had you figured for a friend. You sure put me onto a way of selling some steers." "I'm still your friend, fella," the man gurgled. "If you let me up, I'll tell you about it. I don't talk so good, with a man stacked up on my belly." He wasn't packing a gun. Rip let him up. He brushed dust from his clothes and said, "If you want proof of me being a friend, find that bit of paper I was toting. I figured to leave it where you'd find it, and skip." I wasn't looking for thanks. Rip flared more matches and found the paper. By match light, he read the message scrawled on it, and a great wave of eager warmth welled up in him. The note said, "If you want to find the Valley of Grass, head northwest from town and drive between the two high peaks dead ahead. You can't mistake the peaks, as they are the highest on the ridge country. The valley is 40 miles away, just beyond the peaks." Rip took it all in, feeling mighty excited, until a warning of caution breathed into him. Then he looked at the barkeep. "Start talking, fella. Who sent you?" "Nobody. Just thought I'd do you a good turn, that's all." "Thanks a lot," Rip said. "But what was the idea of sneaking around that way? Me, when I want to do a friend a good turn, I face him with it." "I've got a reason," the man said awkwardly. "Let's leave it at that, huh? Now you can drive straight to the valley." "Sure, but..." Rip was still puzzled. "How come you knew I was looking for the Valley of Grass?" "I never mentioned it to you." "I ain't a fool, mister. Just a barkeep, maybe, but not a fool. Why in hell would you bring cows to the ridges if you wasn't looking for the valley?" Rip nodded slowly, peering in the night, trying to read the fat man's face. He said, "You've kind of solved my problem, and I'm mighty thankful if this note tells the truth. On the other hand, you work in a saloon run by a man who's no friend of mine. I'd sure hate to think that I was headin' into a cunning little trap of some sort." "The valley's where I say," the barkeep insisted. "If you want to go there, go there. Or go to hell if you want. I'm going back to my room." "Wait a minute," Rip said quickly. "I don't want to seem ungrateful, fella. But you've got to admit..." "Look, let's not go into any more," the barkeep said. "I work for a guy who works me long and pays me short, like I done told you the other day. I hate Hogan. That's the reason I tried to slip you this note. I'm not saying any more. If you've got any danged brains at all, work it out for yourself." He turned away, and Rip heard his footsteps fade in the night. Chapter 8. When Rip Campbell and Seth Willis pulled out of White Ridge, they were well stocked with provisions and trail gear. Both saddle packs bulged, while each man carried a 6-gun, a Winchester repeater, and belts. Rip was ready for trouble, and had gone to great pains to impress Willis that the drive would be a dangerous undertaking. Then other thoughts crowded his brain, and he frowned. He said, "Seth, did you fix for a fella to keep an eye on Daisy?" "Sure did, Texan. Man named Dave Jones. I can trust him. He's going to enlist a friend, and between them they'll guard the gal day and night till Virgil Morgan leaves town." "That all right?" "It's fine," Rip said. "It's one worry off my mind anyways. And now, I'll tell you what we're going to do, Seth. See those high and mighty peaks, towering in the mist to the northwest? Well, we're heading between them. And on the other side of the pass, we're going to find the Valley of Grass, or somebody was lying." "You mean you've found out where the valley is?" "Maybe," and Rip told of the happenings of last night. He told it all, Willis listening interestedly but with the touch of doubt that had bothered Rip. The redhead said, "That sure was a funny way to do you a turn, sneaking around like a scared coyote." "Sure is," Rip said thoughtfully. "But I've been thinking. It makes as much sense as all the other crazy things that have happened to me. First, I was kind of discouraged from crossing the bridge back at Long Knife Canyon. Then at White Ridge, Lou Hogan showed that he didn't want me or my herd cluttering up the ridges. Then Daisy heard Virgil Morgan, and Kit Ferris planning to kill me. Let's look at all that, Seth, and see what we get." "I'm looking," Willis said. "What do we get?" "The only possible answer," Rip grinned. "People looking for Grotzen range on the ridges ain't popular. That's why the bridge is down there at Long Knife, with its plumb outrageous toll to turn herders in another direction." "And why?" "Because the only grazing range among the ridges is the Valley of Grass. The way I see it, Lou Hogan, who seems to run and own most everything in these parts, also wants to own the Valley of Grass. That's why herders ain't wanted up here." "All right," Seth said, sliding his hat back to scratch a puzzled head. "So he wants the valley to himself. That ain't no reason he should hire killers to stop you." Hogan's been in the Ridge country long enough to start a bank, a string of saloons, and other businesses. In that time, he could have taken over the valley. All he had to do was flop a herd there and put in a claim to the government. "You're right," Rip said, grinning. "But there's some unknown factor in it somewhere. Maybe I'll figure it out if I keep thinking about it." All that day, while the sun climbed, hovered, then began its westward fall, they drove the tiny herd toward the peaks. The peaks were still perhaps 30 miles away, their lofty crowns lost in rain cloud. Ever since Rip had been at White Ridge, there had been signs of rain to the north, and he got to thinking that the much-sought Valley of Grass would be a lush place indeed, green and rich with nourishment for his herd. It was a pitifully small herd, but enough to satisfy government rules for the taking over of range in unsettled territory. That was Rip's main object. There would be plenty of time after that, time to grow and multiply, the years slowly building his reward. It was a long day in the saddle, but the two men stuck it out until sundown, anxious to reach the valley as soon as possible and willing to skip lunch because of it. At sundown, they found a flat coulee of skimpy grass and sage with a fresh stream nearby. They struck camp. Over a good meal of bacon and biscuit, they discussed plans for the night. Rip said, "Reckon Morgan and Ferris won't take long to catch us up once they leave town. Don't take long for a couple of riders to catch a plodding herd. Reckon we'd better do half a night's watch each, huh? I'll take the first half." Nothing happened during the long 6 hours, and when Rip retired to his bunk, the next 6 hours passed as quietly. He woke up to find Willis already making coffee at a fire, his rough face split in a grin. But later, packed up and on their way once more, they found that nearing the peaks was a more difficult job than it looked. The country was very broken, a maze of narrow trails and canyons among sage-dotted ridges, a twisted, baked mess of territory in which they frequently came to a dead end of rock or precipice and had to retrace their tracks to try another way. Chapter 9. It was a disappointing day, until late in the afternoon when they found a wider, straighter trail and at last made some real northing. But the sun sank quickly after that, and soon they were camped in a rocky pass only a few miles from the previous stop. Willis shrugged and grinned. "I sure hope that Morgan and his sidewinder have as much dang trouble as we're having," he said. "One thing's sure. We've left such a mess of cattle tracks up and down these ridges, Morgan ain't going to know which way to trail us." Rip shook his head. "No, I reckon you're wrong. They likely know the way to the valley. I reckon we're on the right trail now, but Morgan'll likely hit it without messin' about. I've got a feelin' we'll need to keep a sharp watch tonight, pard." They ate well, washing it down with coffee, then yarned and smoked for a while. The dusk melted into blackness, but there were no stars overhead. The black clouds had spread during the day, and in the breeze there was a freshness that spoke of rain. It was Willis's turn to take first watch, and Rip hit the bunk and was soon sleeping. When he woke up to find the redhead shaking him, he started up urgently. "What is it? Are they here?" Seth grinned. "They're miles away, Texan. But they're on our trail. From the ridge behind, I could just see their campfire, like a speck of light." "Then why'd you wake me?" Rip started to growl. "It's midnight, Texan. You done slept like a babe. Up you get." Rip grinned ruefully and climbed to his feet. It seemed only a few minutes since he'd hit the bunk. Seth passed him the Winchester and settled down, and before he'd walked a dozen yards, the redhead was snoring. Rip went to the ridge and looked back trail. Sure enough, he saw the campfire, and from its size and flicker, he judged it to be maybe 6 or 7 miles away. Not far from where he and Seth had camped last night, he figured, though he wasn't too sure about the accuracy of his judgment. Distances at night are very deceiving. He squatted on the ridge top. Behind him was the camp, with Seth bunked down near the dying fire, while to his left the herd rested in. It hit Rip kind of suddenly, the fact that it was after midnight and Seth slept back there near the dying fire. Of course, any campfire would be dying by now. Any honest campfire. But the distant one still blazed. Rip could tell by its color and the way it flickered that it still blazed. There was something queer about that. Why would any campfire still be burning strongly at this hour? There could be some simple explanation, of course, but in the last few amazing days, Rip had come across situations where the explanations were far from simple. For that reason, he was uneasy now. He sat smoking and puzzling about the fire, but if there was an answer to the puzzle, it eluded him. Afterwards, of course, he called himself a fool for not having guessed the answer. When action came, it was sudden, and for one confusing moment, Rip thought all hell had broken loose. Gunfire thundered away on his right, a volley of 6 gunshots splitting the night and rousing the steers to frightened bellowing. It made a hideous chorus, but Rip didn't have time to think about it. Almost as soon as the racket started, the Texan was rolling desperately, dropping his rifle and groping for his .45 while a hail of bullets spattered the ground about him. Rip's brain worked as quickly as his scrabbling body. As his gun came from the holster, he knew that the spattering bullets around him were coming from a group of boulders nearby. He could see the gun flashes. It was 2 separate attacks, one against him while the other stampeded the cattle. Another shot from the boulders was uncomfortably close, and Rip rolled again. He came up hard against a high slope of rock and began to work his way round its base. Out on the flat, the steers were milling and trampling, still stirred by the gunfire. Rip knew that they would run and keep running. He was suddenly sick with despair. Another shot brought him back to the dangerous realities, and quickly he snaked round his rock and upward to higher ground. A moment later, he saw a flash from the boulders. Keeping the position in mind, he aimed down from his height and threw a shot. There was a howl in the darkness, rising for a moment above the hellish din of gunfire, stampeding cattle, and yelling men. Not sure about how effective his shot had been, he waited. He heard the wrathful shouts of Seth Willis joining the din out on the flat. The cattle were thundering away now, their frightened bellows fading in the distance. Rip fired another shot at the boulders, but nobody took the opportunity to fire at his gun flash. Swiftly, he left his rock and sprinted toward the rumpus on the nearby flat. Out there, 2 men were shooting at each other, both swearing savagely. Rip saw the 2 lots of gun flashes and was baffled. He knew one man was Seth, and had no way of knowing which. Then the problem was left to work itself out, as suddenly a hurtling horse and rider boomed out of the darkness and was upon Rip before he could move. The impact crashed him yards along the ground, and the flying hoofs followed up, so that for a few breathless moments he expected his skull to be smashed like an eggshell. Then he stopped skidding, and the hoofs thundered by, and a moment later Rip sank into a velvet blackness that was darker than the cloud-bound night. He came alive to the probing flare of a match, and beyond its light he saw the homely face of Willis. The miner grinned at him and said, "Well, thank goodness you're alive. You had me kind of baffled. Dead to the world, but no bullet punctures. What happened?" "Believe it or not," Rip said dazedly, "I was knocked down by a horse." "Let it be a lesson to you," Seth grinned. "Always look both ways before." "Hey!" Rip cried, sitting up and staring at a red mess that trickled from Willis's arm. "You've been hit. Is it bad?" "Nah." The match flickered out, and Seth walked away in the darkness. "Ain't nothing but a scratch, I feel fine." Then his legs folded under him, and he crashed to the ground. Rip dragged the tall miner to the fireside and stirred the embers to a glow that gave some light. He looked at the wound in Willis's upper arm, a deep flesh wound in which the cruel lead still rested. Quickly Rip heated the blade of a jackknife, figuring that if he hurried he'd have the slug out while Seth was still unconscious and save him some pain. The redhead came to, as Rip was bandaging the arm. "Did I fall asleep?" he asked. "What do you know? Must be all this tough trail driving making me tired, huh?" "Maybe," Rip grinned. "Or it could have been that a bullet was resting against your arm bone. It ain't any more." "Thanks, Rip," Willis said quietly. Then he struggled up, forgetting his pain like the tough hombre he was. "What now? And what in hell happened, anyways?" "I'll tell you what happened," Rip said. "You and me, we was fooled like a couple of greenhorn dudes." "That's so. How come?" "That fire back K-trail," Rip grinned. "That nice bright fire. Not just a heap of embers, mind you, like any campfire at midnight. No, sir, a fire kept burning to attract our attention and make us feel that the enemy was miles away while he sneaked in and caught us by surprise. An old Injun trick." "And how many hombres attacked us?" Seth asked. "Me? I'm still kind of confused. I woke up to find hell roaring all around." "Reckon there was 3, Rip said. "I think I shot one. Then, while you were shooting it out with another, a third hightailed it out of here and knocked me down." "What happened to the hombre you were fighting?" "Think I winged him," Seth said. "He rode off, yelling like crazy. He was the one doing most of the shooting and hooting around the herd. I was sure mad at that boy. But he did his job." Rip frowned. "Those cows won't stop running for hours, I guess. By the time we catch up with them, dang blast it, I might as well face it, Seth. I'm about beaten." "Only time a man's beaten is when he's 6 feet under the ground, Texan," Willis grinned. "You know it. It's just that you're a little downhearted at the moment." "I'd hate to feel plumb disappointed," Rip growled. "Let's go see if I killed my man, huh? We can't start trailing my herd till morning, no how." Together, they went to the group of boulders from where Rip had been attacked. Rip flared matches and found the body. The thin face was easy to recognize, despite the ugliness of a bullet hole through one cheek. Rip grinned rather grimly. "One less to worry about, anyways. That's Virgil Morgan's sidewinder, Kit Ferris. I saw him playing cards in town. Sure hope he was luckier at cards than at shooting in the dark. That shot of mine was one hell of a lucky one, huh?" "If that's what you do in the dark," Seth grinned, "I'd sure hate to shoot it out with you in daylight." "Wonder what Morgan'll do when Ferris doesn't show up back at their camp," Rip said. "I was supposed to be killed, remember? When Ferris doesn't show up, Morgan'll guess I'm still alive. Ferris' part in the raid was to get me, see? Then likely the Morgan hombre'll play a return match," Seth said. "I sure hope he was the one I winged. Reckon we'd better keep watch again." "Sure do. But it's still my watch. You go back to sleep, Seth." The redhead was glad to obey, the pain in his arm more severe than he pretended. Rip went back to his ridge top and saw that the distant fire wasn't so bright or flickering. It was being let die now, he knew. And he wondered how many people were concerned in the treacherous raid. More than the 3 who'd actually taken part, he figured. They must have taken quite a time to cover the 6 or 7 miles of such rugged country in the dark, which meant that somebody else stayed behind to keep the fire fed. A moment before the attack, it had been burning brightly. So that there were 4 enemies on the trail, originally. There were 3 now. Virgil Morgan was one. Who were the other 2? The Griffith brothers, maybe. Of course, there could have been more than one man remaining by the fire, so that there could be more than 3 left. The thoughts stirred restlessly in Rip's angry brain, helping to dull his despair at losing the herd. Chapter 10. For the remaining hours until dawn, he watched alertly, but there was no further incident. Before sunup, the two had taken breakfast and were in the saddle, setting out to find the lost cows. Trailing them over the dusty passes between ridges was easy enough, the way of their passing showing plainly. They had run to the east, taking the natural path from passage to passage between rises and boulder-strewn ridges. Rip and Seth Willis heeled their mounts to a fast pace, but without much hope. But the hope rocketed 2 hours later, when Rip swung his buckskin round a rocky outcrop and saw the herd. They were just ahead, standing quietly, a few steers lifting their heads from skimpy grass to watch the approach of the horsemen. Willis drew beside Rip to yell in glee. "What a break! Man, are you lucky!" They ran into another blind alley and had to pull up. It was true. Ahead of the herd there was a high cliff that blocked the entire pass, and Rip threw back his head to laugh. He yelled, "This is the best luck I've had since I hit this danged ridge country." Half an hour later they were driving toward the peaks, back at their old game of testing this pass and that. But now they seemed to have better luck, and the few times they were forced to retrace their tracks, it was only over short distances. Rip's luck seemed to have changed for the better, and the old hope came back to him as he made good time, and the peaks came closer. They drove hard all day. And an hour before sundown, they passed from a narrow passage to a clean, wide trail which looked like the original one. Certainly, it curved away to a point between the peaks, like a trail that knew where it was headed. Willis whooped. "Now we're plumb right, Texan. Now it'll be plain, trekking all the way to your danged valley of grass. Providing the coyotes from White Ridge don't catch up with us," Rip said. "Which they surely will." They did, just at sundown. At least, they caught up to within shooting range. There was a spurt of dust at the buckskin's feet, and a whipping report that echoed across distance. Seth Willis yelled excitedly, "Long-range shooting, from that ridge away on the right. I saw a puff of smoke. There's another." The bullet whined overhead before its report cracked, and that was long-range shooting indeed. Rip jerked his .45 out and began shooting skyward. "What the hell, are you loco?" Seth yelled. "No, but this time I'll do my own stampeding," Rip answered. "There's just 2 ways the herd can run, and I want them to run north. Those coyotes are shooting at the cows, don't you see?" Even as he spoke, a steer dropped and lay still. With a whoop of rage, Seth jerked his own 6-gun from his belt and joined Rip in raising a ruckus. Together they screamed and fired, their horses dancing, while shots from the distant ridge still spattered the trail. The cattle milled in confusion for a few moments, then thundered away up trail. Rip and his friend ate the dust, and there was a lull in the shooting from the ridge because in the dust cloud they had become invisible. Swiftly, Rip took advantage of the chance that offered. Motioning to Willis, he galloped north, still in the thick of the trail dust from galloping beef, the 2 men choking and blinded. But only for a few moments. Then Rip led the way behind a ridge at the left of the trail, and there they reined back. Gouging dust from his eyes, Rip managed a grin. He said, "The dust hid our movement. Likely they'll figure that we follow the stampede, and they'll leave their ridge to chase us. We'll kind of wait flat at the top of the ridge here, and wait for them, huh?" "A good plan," Seth said. "Supposing I can clean the dust out of my eyes to see them when they get here. What do we do now? Go to the top of the ridge." "That's right," Rip said, and they slid from their saddles. Then they took Winchesters from saddle holsters and climbed the slope. Minutes later, they were flat on the ridge top, scanning the distance. There was no sign of their enemies, though both knew that it didn't mean a thing. The gang could be headed for them, but between lower ridges at the moment. Alertly watching, Willis said, "What about the herd? Ain't you worried about them?" "No, Seth, I ain't. They're running north, and the trail passes plumb between the twin peaks. It must, I reckon. And a little way beyond the peaks is the Valley of Grass, according to that fat barkeep. So even if the cattle keep running all night, they'll stop when they reach the valley. They've been struggling along on hay and poor grass. They sure ain't going to pass up a valley full of rich green grass. Reckon you're right, Willis said, and suddenly grinned. Seems to be a kind of habit with you, being right. Maybe, Rip said, then tensed. Here they come, riding hell for leather. 2, 3, yeah, that's all. 3 of them. Virgil, Morgan, and the Griffith brothers, I guess. The riders were hurtling their mounts down a last long slope to the trail, drawing closer to the ambush every moment. Seth Willis lifted his rifle eagerly, a hard grin on his face. I'll take the hombre on the big black, the one that's leadin', he said, and before Rip could stop him, he fired. It was the wrong time to shoot, but it was done now, and Rip joined in the ruckus. He'd wanted the enemy right on the open trail below, sitting shots without cover, but Willis in his eagerness had spoiled things. Now the 3 enemy riders had hauled back and were plunging their mounts for the cover of sage and boulders east of the trail. They made difficult targets, though the range wasn't long. One man threw a quick shot from the saddle as he dived for cover, the slug gouging dust from beside Rip's elbow. Next moment, the riders were among reasonable cover, and the two-way rumpus raged. Damn me for a doggone fool, Seth Willis swore, seeing his mistake now. I should have waited till they was past all cover and on the open trail below. Rip grinned but said nothing. Bullets spurted the dust around them as he and Seth traded shots with the men on the other slope. Seth said, "Danged if I know what we're shooting at. Can't see enough of them coyotes to aim at." "They're having the same trouble," Rip said. "We're high and flat on the ground, and unless they're mighty good shots they ain't going to hurt us. It's a kind of deadlock at the moment. The real fun won't start until it's dark, I guess." With both sides realizing the position, the shooting slackened, though Seth was ever on the alert for anybody foolish enough to show a piece of himself above the boulders. Rip Campbell filled in his time differently, studying the layout of slopes and ridges so that he wouldn't be baffled when the after-dark juggling of positions began. He quickly decided that a quick retreat to the north would be the best strategy. 2 men could be outpositioned by 3, especially in the dark. And though Seth would have been the last to complain, Rip knew that the bad arm was troubling him and that he wasn't in the best condition for a night-long battle of nerves. He said to Willis, "We likely surprised them by waiting to fight when they'd figured that we'd run. Now we'll fool them the other way. Soon as it's dark we'll get to blazes out of here and leave them to surround an empty ridge." He suddenly grinned. With a bit of luck, they might even start shooting at each other in the dark. "Whatever you say," Seth shrugged. "Me, I'd just as soon shoot it out with them." But Rip sensed that the miner was secretly relieved and said no more. Just to keep the waiting enemy on their toes, he sent an occasional bullet to spatter the boulders. But before it could be put into effect, a new factor appeared. The heavy cloud which had haunted the Twin Peaks for so long now spread over the sky again and began to drip rain. While the dusk still lingered, the rain became a steady drizzle that slowly soaked the 2 men on the open ridge. The ones below, Rip figured, would enjoy a certain amount of shelter from the boulders. "This'll lay the dust," Seth said cheerfully. "I reckon." He stopped, staring below with eyes squinted against the gloom. "Say, look at that." Rip was already looking. One of the party below had left the boulders. He was on a horse and heeling it back up the slope to the east. Seth raised himself a little on the ridge and aimed his rifle. The shot boomed in the dusk, but vision was difficult, and the hombre's horse was sliding and plunging on the rain-greased slope. A moment later, Rip and Willis were flat on the ridge, while the men remaining below replied with angry shots. When the shooting stopped, the horseman had disappeared in the gloom, headed back from where he and his friends had come. "Well, what do you make of that?" Rip frowned. "He's gone back to town for Macintoshes," Seth grinned. "He's gone back to the far ridge, "The one from where they shot at us first," Rip said. "I sure wish I knew why." "Maybe there are more men back there," Seth said seriously now. "Might be they're bringing in reinforcements to surround this ridge after dark. You want to know something? I'm beginning to think that your retreating plan is a good one. And I figure it's about dark enough to start on it," Rip said. "Let's snake back from the ridge top and make for our horses." A few moments later, they were half sliding, half screaming down the blind side of the ridge. The rain was still drizzling strongly, a fine, wetting rain which had quickly made mud of the loose dust underfoot. Rip and Willis were soaked, their riding boots caked with mud by the time they reached the horses. Pausing only to scrape slush from heels, they swung to the wet saddles and quietly walked the animals northward. The cushion of mud underfoot helped them to move quietly. It was now almost dark, but they could still see the bulk of the ridge at their right, black against the cloudy sky. The ridge seemed to continue north for a long way. But it had to peter out somewhere, and then the two riders would swing back to the main trail and go in pursuit of the cattle. With the night black all around them, the rain fell harder. The cold seeped into their bodies, water from floppy hats cascaded down their faces, and they could no longer see the ridge at the right. With a kind of happy despair, Seth Willis said, "And I left a comfortable miner's hut for this." "Bear up," Rip cracked back. "This kind of life will make a man of you." Just the same, he was worried about the redhead. It wasn't good for a wounded man to be subjected to cold and rain, and he silently cursed the weather. But the rain continued, and in the wet darkness it became difficult to be sure of direction. It was a nightmare ride, but a long hour later they suddenly found themselves on the main trail. Rip's policy of keeping the lower slope of the ridge underfoot had paid off, swinging the party to the right as the ridge faded out. And at the same time, the rain eased off. Soon the rain had stopped altogether, and against a lightened sky they saw the dark shapes of twin peaks ahead, mighty peaks now, and the open wideness of the trail which aimed between them. Along the open trail they made better time, heeling the horses for speed. Rip wondered what was going on back at the ridge, and knew that the gang would sooner or later realize that their intended victims had flown. And he kept thinking of that rider who'd returned to the far ridge. Why had he gone back? To fetch more men, as Willis had suggested. At the end of another hour they had put a lot of distance behind, and it was then that Seth yelled, "Hey Rip, have you noticed? We're kicking dust again. Look." He was right. Dust was billowing behind the loping horses, hovering whitely in the night. Rip said, "That means it hasn't rained here, huh? Looks like this is where we get our coffee." They pulled off the trail and went over a rocky ledge. Soon they found a spot that was hidden from the trail, and there they opened pack rolls to dry and gathered wood for a small fire. In the dark, they could see no stream around, but there was enough water in their canteens for coffee. Half an hour later, they left warm and cheerful. "With the herd off our hands and being well hid here, we'll skip the sentry work," Rip said. "Those coyotes are a long way behind anyways. And we sure need the sleep." They slept well, despite the dampness of blankets, and the sun was slanting its rays into the rocky nook by the time they awoke. They breakfasted hurriedly, then Rip climbed a high ridge to scan the distant back trail. From that high point, he could see a lot of territory. The wide trail climbed steadily from a long way south, sometimes curving out of sight behind rises, but always appearing again until finally it lost itself in the misty distance. And though Rip watched for a long time, there was no sign of pursuit. Rip was about to return to Seth and the horses when, away to the southeast, he spotted a great haze of dust that hovered above the ridges. He stared, frowning. At first, he thought it was a dust storm. Then he decided that it was too self-contained for one. He had seen dust storms that approached at a fast rate and seemed to spread across the face of the earth, but the dust he watched now was confined to one area, and if moving at all, only slowly. It was a long way off, he decided. And as he watched and wondered, the truth seeped into him. Such dust could be raised by riders, but it sure would need to be an army of riders. That left just one answer. "Hey," Seth yelled from below. "How much longer are you going to stay perched up there? What's so interesting?" Rip climbed down the ridge and smiled at the waiting redhead. He said, "The plot thickens, as those actor hombres say. And now, I'm beginning to understand a lot of things." A minute later, Rip and Willis were in the saddles and headed north along the wide trail, following the plain tracks of the little herd that had passed hours earlier. Seth looked at the Texan, his smile eager. "So you understand a lot of things, huh? Such as?" "Well, first of all," Rip said, "back there to the southeast there's a dust haze so wide and slowly moving that it can only mean beef on the hoof. A danged big herd, Seth, and being drove in this direction." "Along the trail, D0 you mean?" Seth cried. "Not along this trail. Must be another way, into the valley of grass after all. That's where the big herd is headed, sure." "I guess you're right." Rip smiled grimly and said, "I ain't guessing. I'm kind of putting two and two together and getting reasonable answers. Like 4, maybe." "Like 4, Seth. Now I know why Lou Hogan hired Virgil Morgan to kill me and scatter my herd. I had a day or so start in a race for the valley, and he was aiming to hamper me. Or rub me out altogether. Like we figured earlier, he wants the valley of grass for himself. But though he's been in White Ridge for years, it's only kind of recent that he or his stooges have discovered the valley. For a long time, it was just a traveler's tale, nobody knowing whether it really existed. I was kind of doubtful and worried myself when I drove my herd up here. But Hogan discovered it at last, and made arrangements for a herd to be bunked down there so as he could claim the valley. Then," Willis said, "while the arrangements were underway, along comes a Texan with his own little herd." "That's right. At first, Hogan thought I wanted to sell the lot for beef, and was quite happy. Sure, he'd put the Griffith brothers at the Long Knife Bridge to stop any beef but his own coming into the ridges, but so long as I wanted to sell mine for meat, he didn't mind. But when he found that I was aiming to push on, he sure knew that I was looking for the valley." "I see what you mean. His herd was on the way, but they hadn't reached the ridges yet. Yours had. So he calls in his gunslingers to stop you." "That's the way it looks," the Texan said. "And the herd he's got is a big one, headin' in this direction along another route. Not that it'll do Hogan any good, I reckon. My cows are likely in the valley by now, which makes it my valley." "According to government rules, sure," Seth said, scratching his head. "But then, according to government rules, you can't have other people shot and their herds stampeded. But that don't stop Hogan from doing just that. Texan, you've got a hell of a fight on your hands, no matter whether you're first into the valley or not. It ain't what happens that counts. It's what Washington's told that matters." "You're plumb right," Rip said. "But if I'm first into the valley, I'm going to fight like hell to stay there. Maybe I'll be outnumbered, but, well, I've gotten out of tight spots before. I'll figure some way out." "We'll figure a way out." Chapter 11. All day long, they rode northward. The last mile's long stretch of trail, where it lay between the peaks, was bounded by steep walls of rock at each side. Where earlier, it had simply been a clear way between ridges and boulders, now it was a deep channel in which travel was possible in only two directions, north and south. Clouds still clung to the tips of the peaks, but overhead the sky was a blue mass from which the sun beat strongly. Riding deep along the channel-like trail, the two men sweated. And the peaks that towered high beyond each channel wall seemed to move past so very slowly, distance and height creating an illusion that no matter how long they rode, the men would never get any further north. But they did, of course. A lot of miles were left behind, with still the trail bounded by high walls and cliffs, but by late in the afternoon, the bulk of the Twin Peaks were slightly behind. "We're through," Rip grinned, mopping sweat from his face. "I guess the Valley of Grass can't be much further. Likely we'll reach it in the morning, huh?" "Sure hope so," Willis said. "Meantime, we're out of water, and there don't seem to be any around. Do you reckon we'll have to camp dry, right here on the trail?" "Don't know," Rip said. He saw that the redhead was a little pale and drawn, and guessed at a sick man's need for water behind the casual question. "Must be a break somewhere along these danged walls," Rip said, looking at the cliffs that hemmed them in. "Likely there are streams outside if only we could get to them." They kept a sharp lookout, but it was sundown before any kind of break appeared. Then it wasn't much more than a slanting crack in the east wall, very narrow and too steep for a horse to manage. But Rip figured that a man could make the climb, and he reined back and slid from the saddle. Taking the 2 saddle canteens, he went to the wall and started up the slanting crevice. Some of it was tough going, but his young muscles were equal to it. In 20 minutes, he was at the top of the high wall, and waved in triumph to Seth Willis. From the top he could see far down the trail, and almost the first thing he saw was trail dust in a small cloud and moving slowly, maybe 12 miles back. The light was good, and visibility clear, and soon Rip was able to make out 4 riders. 4. He did some hard thinking. The figures were too far away to be recognized, but he guessed that they were the gang with whom he and Seth had been tangling. There had been only 3 in the last rifle ruckus, but one had retraced his tracks. Had he gone back for the 4th? If so, why? Why had the 4th member of the party remained behind that far ridge last night? Rip could find no answer. And as he watched, he saw that the party, tiny specks in the distance, were leaving the trail. They could do it, not yet having reached the walled-in section. Rip guessed that they were striking camp for the night. The next thing Rip saw was that big haze of dust to the southeast. Now it was much closer, and certainly the dust of a driving herd. He still couldn't see the cattle, but ahead of where the dust hovered he saw a wide trail, almost as wide as the one he and Willis were traveling. It snaked forward, between ridges and lightly timbered valleys, past Rip's position only a mile to the east, and dipped out of sight along a canyon. Rip went looking for water, a new thought troubling him. Soon he found a fresh stream that bubbled from the slopes of the east peak, and he filled the canteens. Half an hour later, he was with Seth once more, and they began making rough camp on the trail. "The gang are following behind," Rip said, frowning. "There are 4 of them now. I sure would like to know who the 4th hombre is. I figure that the other 3 are Morgan and the Griffith brothers. Maybe it's Lou Hogan. Reckon not. If Lou's out on the job at all, he'll be with his herd. The herd's pretty close to us now. You know what, Seth? Seems like the trail the herd is ussin' swings plumb into this one, not too far ahead. It bears watchin'. With the gang of 4 trailin' us behind, and that enemy herd and its drivers clowin' in at the side, looks like we're going to be kind of busy in the next day or 2. That night, seeing that they were right on the open trail, they took it in turn to stay awake and watch. But nothing happened. And next morning, with Seth Willis looking more like his old self at last, the 2 men were up and eating before sunrise. Rip wanted to get away to an early start, figuring to reach the Valley of Grass as soon as possible. Just the same, he took time out to climb the wall again and scan the distance. The gang back trail were already moving, he saw. The herd hadn't started yet, for there was no dust. He wondered about the herd, anxious to reach the expected fork in the trail before the cattle. Rip and Willis rode north again, and at a good speed. The ride continued between those high walls, but was without incident until the fork appeared. It was mid-morning then. The fork was at the east side, another channeled trail joining the main one as Rip had expected. "And the herd are headed up that fork," he said grimly. "They'll be along purty soon, I reckon." He looked ahead and noted how the country seemed to flatten out, with fewer ridges and a lot more scrub and timber. He said, "The valley of grass ain't far off now, pard. Neither is the fight of our lives, unless I can think of something." Then he did think of something. Suddenly, he slapped a hand to his lean thigh and looked at Willis with a face that was hard and determined. "Say, let's rein back for a while. I want to talk." Seth reined back and said, "I'm listening." "Let's kind of sum up our chances in a fight," Rip said. "There's just you and me, and your bad arm ain't going to help you to shoot straight. Against us, there'll be the 4 who are trailing us, and the men who are driving the herd along the fork. Another 4 maybe, or more. That ain't so good, huh? 2 against 8 ain't good in any language. All right. So we've got to resort to cunning, I reckon. And seeing that the gang have been so dead set on killing us, I don't aim to play any fairer than I have to. Seth, we ain't going any further. We're waiting right here." "Are we, Texan?" "Why?" "Well, first, I don't want the herd to reach the valley of grass. Second, I don't want to have to fight against odds. So we'll wait here and kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, as the saying goes. I figure that the herd'll reach the fork before the gang who were trailing us. Well, we'll take up positions high somewhere handy and turn on hell with our Winchesters when the herd arrives. We'll stampede them down the main trail before the dang trail drivers know what's hit them. That way, we'll turn Hogan's beef back from the valley and destroy Morgan's gang at the same time. They'll be in the walled part of the main trail by then, and there'll be no escape. The big herd'll run smack into them, round one of those curves, and trample them to pulp. And all we'll have to worry about is the trail drivers, who'll be on the open fork and sitting shots for us, unless we can persuade them to surrender." Seth Willis's eyes were lit with excitement. He said, "That's the plan of a desperate man, but I'm all for it. Let's find a place on these slopes where we can shoot anything in sight." They loped off the trail and studied the surroundings. At each side of where the trails met, the land sloped in broken layers that overlooked the junction. Rip picked his spots. He said, "I'll wait up there at that side." He pointed to a rock shelf 50 feet above the main trail and a little beyond the junction. He directed Seth to a similar position on the west side of the trail. "It'll depend on good timing," he warned the redhead. "I'll wave my neckerchief when it's time to start shooting. I'm going to wait until the biggest part of the herd have rounded from the fork into the main trail. The drivers'll still be in the fork, behind the herd. When we turn the steers back with shots and yells, their own drivers'll be blocking the fork, so they'll just kind of naturally run south down the main trail. Bringing death to Virgil Morgan and his coyotes. I sure hope it works, Texan. One thing I promise you. I won't spoil this rumpus by shooting too soon. I'll wait for your signal." "Let's go," Rip said. They parted, loping their mounts up the broken slopes that sided the fork. Rip left his mount hitched to a tree and stationed himself on the shelf. A moment later, Seth Willis was waving from a similar position opposite. It was a long wait, with 1,000 doubts plaguing Rip Campbell. This thing he proposed to do could easily go wrong, and failure could mean death for himself and for his friend. But he steeled himself for action, determined to succeed. Chapter 12. In the course of the next hour, his future would hang in the balance. And it was a warm future, in which Diane Sanderson would figure largely. He was determined to live it. And this was the best course of action possible, he thought. Better to attack and win by surprise than wait for a long-odds fight which had to come sooner or later. He rolled a smoke and soothed himself with its tangy fragrance. He looked across to the opposite slope and saw that Willis was doing the same. There was a faint, distant rumble on the morning air. But not too distant. To an old cowhand like Rip, the sound was familiar. Beef on the hoof. He looked along the curving fork and saw the dust haze floating above ridges. The bellows of cattle were plainly heard now. Soon he could also hear the soft, rumbling thunder of hoofs, hundreds of plodding hoofs hitting a dusty trail in a kind of whispering chorus. It was a sound he had listened to many times, but never with so much tingling excitement. Long minutes later, the cattle came in view. They filled the wide trail side to side, bobbing head to plodding rump. It was a moving mass of hide and horns, swelling into the trail from round the bend, bobbing leisurely toward the fork. Rip levered a bullet into his barrel and waited. Minutes later, he saw that the entire herd, perhaps 500 strong, were now in view. 3 riders trailed them, and even at the distance he recognized the lean figure of Lou Hogan. He had met Hogan only once, but well remembered the neat cut of him, the set of his sleek head and sloping shoulders. Rip felt a deep hatred for the man, but reminded himself that his feeling was based on mere theory, and until he knew for certain that Hogan had been the one who'd ordered his death, he wouldn't kill Hogan. It was one of those cases where theory wasn't good enough. You had to know. Then he brought his mind back to the task at hand, and watched the herd passing below. Now the leaders were out of the fork and on the main trail north. They plodded further ahead, the mob following. They were bunched tightly, and soon the biggest part of the herd was on the main trail. And as the 3 riders who tailed the herd drew near to the fork, Rip flashed his colored neckerchief. Then there was crackling thunder down the slopes, and the whine of bullets, and crazy yells and screams from Rip and Willis. Thoroughly ruthless, Rip shot 2 of the leading steers, then spattered the dust among others as fast as he could, pump lead to his barrel and pull the trigger. In a surprisingly short time the steers were milling and bellowing stupidly, while Hogan and his men foolishly added to the sound and fury by shooting wildly at Rip and Willis. 6-gun bullets buzzed close, but Rip ignored the danger to concentrate on turning the herd. Seth was backing up well, and a furious volley of shots split the air and echoed around, throwing dust in savage spurts to terrify the steers. They plunged about, colliding and clashing horns, then ran from the barrier of bullets. And because the 3 men who blocked the fork were adding to the gunfire, the herd kept running south along the main trail. Soon they were gone, leaving only a rising cloud of dust, while Hogan and his riders threw raging lead at the tiny targets formed by Rip and Willis as they lay flat on their shelves. "Throw up your hands," Rip yelled, "and drop your guns or we'll cut you down pronto." The bluff didn't work. The 3 men leaped from saddles and ran for the broken slopes, throwing wild shots as they sought cover. And at that moment, Rip looked across at Willis and saw a horseman bearing down on him from behind. "Look out!" Rip yelled. But Willis turned, jumped to his feet, and ran back from his ledge to greet the rider. The rider had come over a ridge to the west, and Rip had never seen him before. But it looked as if Seth knew him and was friendly. The redhead spoke with the man, then yelled urgently to Rip. "Hey Texan, this here's Dave Jones. Been looking all over for us. Virgil Morgan outsmarted him and kidnapped the Sanderson gal." Rip ran back to where his horse was hitched, leapt to the saddle, and hurtled down the slopes to the fork. A volley of 6-gun slugs burned the air as Hogan and his men from the cover of boulders fired at him. Rip felt the kicking impact of lead against his gun holster, while another shot scorched the hair of his neck. But his thoughts were for nothing but Daisy Sanderson's danger, and he didn't bother to reply to the shooting. He flogged his buckskin along the fork, then swung off it to climb the west slopes. By then, he was out of gun range, leaving Willis to deal with Hogan and his men. If he spared Seth a thought at all, it was that his friend would help him shoot it out. But mostly, his thoughts were of Daisy, and the unlucky turn of events that had put her in such terrible danger. That fool Jones, whom Willis had trusted to look after the girl. He'd failed. Morgan had kidnapped her. Likely, he'd known who she was from the moment he'd hit White Ridge. He stares at me a lot, Daisy had said. Yes, he'd known that she was the girl who'd accused him of murder in San Jose, and he hadn't figured to let her run around loose while he was engaged in a similar deal. So before setting out to trail Rip, he had swooped on her. And a lot of puzzling things were clear enough now, the answers falling in place in Rip's troubled brain. He thought of the rifle ruckus, and that gang member who'd gone back to the far ridge. He had gone back to get Daisy, of course. They had left her behind the far ridge when they'd set out to chase Rip and Willis. Just as they had left her with the fourth member of the gang back at the campfire, the night of the raid when Kit Ferris had been killed. Probably they kept her roped up. Ferris' death had reduced their masculine number to 3, but Daisy had been the puzzling fourth hombre in the party that Rip had seen backtrail yesterday. But these thoughts flitted swiftly and unimportantly through Rip's brain as he raced his horse wildly over the broken country, keeping a course parallel to the walled-in main trail that dropped southward. The important thing now was that somewhere along that trail, Daisy was riding with her captors, trapped between those sheer walls, while death in the shape of the stampeding herd ran headlong to meet her. And when Rip thought of how the stampede had been set in motion deliberately by himself, he went sick with despair. If she died, he would never forgive himself. Damn it, he should never have left her to the danger which had so obviously lurked in White Ridge. The buckskin had been one of the fastest mounts in the Pecos Basin, and now Rip called for everything it had. The animal responded gamely, and though it was rough and broken country, the general slope was downhill, and Rip began to hope against hope that the impossible might be managed. Ahead and to his right, the dust haze of the running herd floated above the trail wall. But the herd itself was still far ahead. Rip had one big advantage. His horse could run fairly straight, swinging to avoid sage and rocks but keeping a true course, while the deep trail at his right curved about a lot. By cutting across in a straight line where the curves occurred, Rip made some big gains on the running herd. Soon he was level with the dust haze where it rose above the trail, but the cattle were still a little way ahead. Dust always billowed out behind a running herd and floated upward in its wake. Still, they weren't too far ahead. Above the clatter of his buckskin's hooves, he heard the bellowing of cows and sometimes caught the trembling thunder of their hooves. Then, almost before he realized it, the Texan ran headlong into trouble. He topped a slight rise and headed crazily down a slope, only to see a yawning gap in the ground. The gap was hurtling toward him, a wide split in the earth, with empty space dropping away into shadow. He had a split second to decide what to do. To pull up and look for a way around the hazard would be to lose all hope of reaching Daisy before the herd. To risk a jump could mean death. Without a second thought, he thrashed the scared horse and sent him charging down the slope. The gap loomed closer, seeming to leap at the chance to swallow a victim. The buckskin's forelegs went high, and his muscular hindquarters heaved. There was a breathless moment as the horse hovered in space, and Rip glimpsed a shining ribbon of water at the bottom of the gorge, 500 feet below. Then the buckskin scrabbled to a skidding, desperate landing on the far bank, dirt and rocks tumbling into the void as the edge crumbled. The buckskin stumbled forward, and Rip felt the sweat go cold on his face. But now there wasn't much time. He swung the racing horse dangerously close to the rugged edge of the trail wall and saw that he'd passed the running cattle. He prayed that Morgan's party might not appear yet, while he was helpless to aid Daisy. As he raced southward, he noticed that the wall of the trail was lower here, maybe 30 feet high, whereas further north it had been 50. Still, it was too sheer for a horse to navigate, and Rip grappled with the problem of how to get down, how to be of any use now that he was here. He had raced to a fair lead on the thundering herd when, at last, he saw 4 riders coming along the trail bed. In a moment, he saw that one was a woman, and as he closed the distance he realized she was roped into her saddle, legs tied to the stirrups, wrists bound to the saddle horn. He'd played with the wild idea of lassoing her, and lifting her from her mount, hauling her up the trail wall to safety, but now it was out of the question. Like flashes of lightning, thoughts came and went, and a new decision was made as Rip skidded his sweating buckskin to a halt and leapt from the saddle on the very edge of the wall. In the next moment, he snatched the lasso from his saddle horn, swiftly anchored it around a jutting rock, and began lowering himself to the trail as the party below drew near. They saw him, of course. Rip heard a lazy-toned voice cry, "Look! It's that dang Texan," and recognized Martin Griffith. Dangling in space at the cliff wall, hands burning on the thin, swinging rope, he heard Daisy's scream mix with the crash of 6 guns as bullets chipped rock and dust inches from his face. Waiting for the stab of a slug into his body, he lowered himself quickly. The bullets followed him down, and one burned a hot crease in the calf of his leg. A moment later, Rip was on the trail, running to meet the party, his .45 hauled from its holster as he yelled, "Pull up! Go back! It's a stampede!" At that moment, he heard the rumble of thunder behind him and knew the gang had heard it too. They stopped shooting, hauling back on their range-bred horses, which recognized the sound and plunged madly. For a moment, there was fear and confusion, and Rip Campbell took advantage of it. Still running toward the party, he fired his gun and saw a man in a wide yellow hat clutch at his chest and fall from the saddle of a big black horse. Virgil Morgan's life had ended. Almost before Morgan hit the ground, Rip was near enough to leap for the empty saddle. Martin Griffith swore from the back of his prancing horse and threw a shot that burned another groove across Rip's shoulder, but Cal Griffith was already low in the saddle and headed swiftly south away from the menacing herd. A moment later, Martin forgot his enmity and fled as well. Rip saw the first steers rounding a bend. Grabbing the reins of Daisy's mount, he heeled his black horse southward. But one horse trailing another was awkward and didn't make for the best speed. Rip looked back and saw the wild-eyed steers gaining. Desperately, he groped for his jackknife, clicked it open, and swung his mount close to the captive girls. Leaning over, he slashed at the ropes binding her wrists to the saddle horn. They didn't speak. In the thunder of hooves and the frightening bellows, they wouldn't have heard each other anyway. At last the ropes parted, and Daisy's reddened wrists were free. Rip could do nothing about her legs. He tossed her the reins, and she took them eagerly, hunching in the saddle to ride as fast as she knew how. And she sure knew how. Her days on her uncle's long Y were paying off as she raced her mount pace for pace with Rip's, her matted hair flying in the wind. Rip noted the rumpled untidiness of her dress, the dust-stained face, the rope marks on her legs and arms, and a black rage welled up in him. It was a strange race for life. Captive, captors, and captors' enemy forgetting their differences as they rode hard to stay ahead of the thundering herd. Martin and Cal Griffith were well ahead, while Rip and the girl had lost ground during the rope slashing. Rip looked back and saw the steers were still too close for comfort, their heavy hooves pounding the trail just 40 yards behind. He heeled his black for more speed and swung close to slap at Daisy's mount, but both horses were already hurtling at their limit. The steer pounded on for a moment, then pitched to the ground and rolled violently, a mess of hooves, horns, and flying dust. It wasn't a great success. A few of the following steers crashed and fell, but the rest swerved neatly to either side. Still, it was a race for life. And then Rip's troubles doubled as a shot burned the air close to him, and Daisy cried in alarm. Martin Griffith was shooting back at him. The short gunman still sported a bandaged hand, which likely spoiled his aim. Another slug chipped Rip's hat, and swiftly he jerked out his .45. His shot was hurried, but lucky. It missed Martin Griffith, and bored through his brother Cal, who'd been riding a few yards ahead. Cal threw up despairing hands and fell from the saddle. As Rip and the white-faced girl raced past, Cal was still rolling. A second later, Rip thought he heard something shrill above the thunder of the herd, but couldn't be sure. Then he saw that the trail walls were falling away at last, and he exulted. Now they were back where the rifle ruckus had taken place. Rip recognized it ahead, the ridge from where he and Seth Willis had fired. Seth had fired too early, and the gang had escaped the death Rip had planned. Just as well, Rip thought now. All the time, Daisy had been behind the far ridge, most likely tied up, and if her captors had died, she would have been left there to starve. It was a surprise to find himself so far back on the trail already. Rip had been confused and worried, hadn't figured that ground which, in an uphill direction, had taken almost a day to cover, could be retraced at breakneck speed downhill in a few hours. Now, as the trail walls fell away, Martin Griffith quickly took advantage and swung away to the slopes. Rip and Daisy followed. When they were well off the trail, they reined back and watched the herd rumble past. Rip gasped for breath, then said, "Them Hogan steers ain't going to stop till they reach Long Knife Canyon. And they ain't going to stop to pay toll either." "Rip," the girl gasped. "Oh, Rip, if you hadn't come along." "I was kind of obliged to," he said, "seeing as how I started the herd running. That was before I knew you were with Morgan, of course." "That beast," she flashed. "He knew I was Daisy Sanderson, after all. Said he was going to take me to his cabin in Montana after this job was finished. You killed him, Rip. I'm glad." A 6-gun shot crashed among the ridges, the bullet thudding into the black horse beneath Rip Campbell. The big beast trembled, and his knees bent. Daisy screamed. Rip slid from the saddle and got clear before the horse hit the ground. "Friend Martin," he yelled, out to avenge his brother. Another shot spurted dust at Rip's feet. Daisy cried, "Up on that rock, there he is, Rip." A third shot thundered, and there was a gasp from the girl. Dazedly, Rip turned and saw blood streaming from her arm. Then, in a blind rage, he bellowed crazily and began scrambling up the rocky outcrop from where Martin was shooting. Shots came in quick succession, but as Rip climbed swiftly and unflinchingly, he seemed immune to hot lead. His rage at what he'd just seen consumed him completely, and 2 more bullet burns across his stumbling body didn't bother him at all. Then there was a lull, and Rip knew Martin had emptied his gun. With a roar of anger mixed with triumph, Rip reached the top of the outcrop. Martin Griffith was squatted there, feverishly trying to reload. He was just snapping the gun shut when Rip shot his bandaged arm. Griffith screamed. He dropped the gun, making a useless attempt to stop it, as it slid over the edge of the rock and fell maybe 30 feet to the ground. Rip fired another shot that smashed Griffith's other arm. The hombre rolled onto his back, his arms useless, and began to sob curses at Rip. Rip kicked him hard in the body, the great rage still driving him. He roared, "You shot the gal, you stinkin' polecat. By hell, Griffith, you'll suffer for that. If there was a damned ant heap around here, I'd smash your legs and leave you on it." "Blast you!" Martin screamed. "You killed Cal." "Like I'm going to kill you," Rip cried. Then he sheathed his gun, walked to the fallen man, and began to kick him toward the edge of the rocky peak. Under the kicking, prodding boots, Martin rolled and squirmed, blood streaming from his flopping arms. No, don't, Campbell. I don't want to die. Look. I'll talk. I'll squeal, tell you the whole setup." "I know the setup," Rip growled. "I know that Hogan wanted me out of the way so he could grab the Valley of Grass. I know a lot of things, Martin, but none so certain as that you're going over the edge of this rock. No, blast you. Don't." The words choked off as Rip, with a final kick, sent the gunman over the edge. There was a horrible scream of terror that ended with a thump. Rip looked down and saw the faintly squirming body sprawled below. He scrambled down the peak and went back to Daisy Sanderson. She hadn't fainted. She was bent over, vainly trying to undo the knots of the ropes that bound her legs to the stirrups. Rip slashed her free, and she slid from the saddle into his arms. "It's all right," she said, smiling at the concern in his eyes. "It's only a crease on my arm, nothing serious. You've collected some creases yourself. "Oh, Rip, you're not hurt, are you?" "I'm fine," he said softly, holding her to him. "I feel great. Now let's look at that arm." He bound her wound and ignored the pain of his own scattered ones. He found Martin Griffith's horse, mounted it, and together they headed north along the trail. Daisy told him the details of the kidnapping, how Virgil Morgan and the Griffith brothers had broken in at the rear of the cafe and taken her, tied and gagged, from her room. It was a long ride back up the sloping northward trail, with Rip now worried about Seth Willis. He'd hated to run out on Seth, but there'd been no time for anything else. Anxiously, he wondered whether Seth's friend Dave Jones was any better at gunfighting than he was at guarding girls. For hours, the horses plodded through the sun-baked channel of the trail. The sun began to lower in the sky. Then Rip Campbell saw a dust cloud rising from beyond a bend in the trail and tensed. "Could be more enemies coming down the trail," he said, easing the gun in his holster. "I'm sorry for them," Daisy breathed, looking sideways at him with shining eyes. "After what I've seen you do to your enemies, I'm right sorry for those ahead." Rip was watching the bend in the trail. Then two horsemen came into view. The horses were loping, but at the sight of Rip and Daisy, the riders reined back and plunged for their 6 guns. But the guns didn't leave the holsters. "Rip, you crazy Texan!" Seth Willis yelled. "You made it. You saved her. How in hell?" Then he looked sheepishly at Daisy. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "It's all right," she laughed gaily. "Everything's all right." "But how did you get on?" Rip cried, riding forward to grip his friend's arm. "You did all right, it seems, huh?" "Ah, me and Dave managed all right," Seth said. "We shot it out. Lou Hogan is dead. And one of his riders is shot in the leg and doesn't want to play anymore. The other fella hit the breeze." "That's great," Rip said, slowly realizing just how great it was. Now all his troubles were over, provided his tiny herd had found the valley of grass and were still there. "And I've got news for you," Willis said, sliding from his saddle. He slapped a great hand on the flank of the horse he'd been riding. "I left my horse resting back at the fork. This fellow was Lou Hogan's. Have a look." He pointed to the brand, and Rip bent low from his saddle to look at it. It was the letter Y, rather tall and slim, an old brand over which the hair had grown but now bared by Seth's probing fingers. Daisy nudged her mount close to look as well. "The long Y," she said. "That horse came from my poor uncle's ranch in the San Jose Valley." "Sure," Rip said. "And Hogan was riding him. You know what it means, I guess." "I had an idea about it. Seeing that Virgil Morgan and the Griffith brothers were working for Hogan, same as they were working for that rangeland investment syndicate. Lou Hogan was Rangeland Investments. He ordered Jed Sanderson's death, like he ordered mine. Likely some of that scattered herd of his came from the Long Y, and the same way." The next morning, they found the lush and beautiful valley of grass, a great hollow of green range with a river down its middle, spreading to every horizon. It was raining when they got there. But who cared about the rain? This was the end of the trail. Rip Campbell stood looking at his future, the dream running sweet in his mind. It was twice as sweet as it had ever been before, because now he shared it with the soaked, ragged little woman who stood beside him, one wet but warm little hand in his. The end. Do you like wild Western adventure? Can I send you a full-length novel free? Get your copy today. Rather, listen. I have over 30 wild Western audiobooks you can hear for free. Saddle up and click play today.